students, in this video I'm going to talk about sort of the early years of the Civil War and the strategies and approaches employed by both sides. Civil War provides the answer to the question that we've been examining since the midterm in this class. And the question is the extent to which the United States will be one integrated nation and the extent to which it will be unified as a collection of states. It is a war that is unquestionably about slavery, but it is also a war that is unquestionably not totally about slavery. And within this conflict, questions about nationalism, questions about states' rights, questions about the relationship of the states to the federal government, these remain important. The first question after the beginning of the Civil War is where the border states will fall. Remember that these were states, the northernmost part of the South, that were still identified as part of the culture of the southern states, who politically were typically aligned with them, but where slavery was not as widespread, was not as numerous as it was in the Deep South. As soon as the firing on Fort Sumter occurs, Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers, as he puts it, to suppress the rebellion of the southern states. And this leads to 4 of these border southern states, Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina, to secede. They say this is a sign of tyranny, that Lincoln is going to use armed force to control or to coerce the southern states. That they may not be ready to secede, but they will secede rather than suppress those who wish to secede. Lincoln, we're told, was especially worried about the state of Kentucky. A slave state, but one that was in a crucial strategic position in terms of its geography, and controlled northern access to states like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, and Lincoln was worried that Kentucky could split these states from the rest of the northern states. And so in these early years of the war, he very much pulled back on language of the war being a war to abolish slavery. He focused much more on the idea of maintaining the Union, of maintaining the nation, this rhetoric of nationalism that had been so successful in the early 19th century. And Kentucky remains very much divided and, for practical purposes, neutral. Lincoln is also worried about the state of Maryland, a slave state, but one that's very far north, that surrounds the whole territory of Washington, D.C., and the state of Delaware, another slave state. If Maryland decides to secede, it means that the capital of the United States will now be surrounded by the Confederate States of America. And so Lincoln, not for the first time, uses armed force in order to secure the political outcome that he wanted. He arrests leaders in the Maryland government who are in favor of secession. He puts them in prison. This prevents the state from voting for secession and keeps it in the Union. The last of these, and also keeps Delaware in the Union. The last of these border southern states is the state of Missouri. It's also the furthest west. A pro-secession militia attempts to take control of the largest city of St. Louis, but is repulsed by a pro-Union militia. And this pro-Union militia will remain in control of St. Louis, which is the most important city in the state, and will, by and large, keep Missouri in the Union. Some of the southern parts of Missouri will be in Confederate hands, but most of the state will be controlled and will remain loyal to the Union. So as the war begins, far more states have remained in the Union than have seceded, so the North has a serious advantage in population. It also has a serious advantage in manufacturing the supplies necessary for war. It has a better transportation network, it has a stronger industrial economy, and it has more ships, which means that it can blockade the eastern coast and prevent the South, or at least limit the South, from sending supplies to trade or receiving war supplies. The South has a wealthy economy, but it's a rural economy. And so this means that it's going to be very difficult for them to raise currency. Remember that they're in some ways starting out from scratch. They have a constitution, but they don't have a government infrastructure. There's a constant tension surrounding the limits of a national government that is at war, but that's based on the idea that was formed in a rejection of a federal government. So many of the states in the Confederate States of America reject mandates from the national government because they say we didn't secede just to agree to what politicians in Richmond or in Montgomery want. And so it is a constant struggle for the Confederates to put together an economy, to put together a cohesive, centralized political system. The Confederate strategy is going to be to fight a defensive war in defense of, so that their soldiers are fighting in defense of their homelands, which is both an emotional advantage and is also a strategic advantage. And that they're going to try and win diplomatic recognition abroad so that they can have the support of maybe Britain or France. You remember how crucial this was to the success of the American Revolutionary War. And so to this end, they're going to stop sending cotton to Europe in order to try and force these economies, desperate for cotton, to give them military support. What actually happens is that these countries find other sources of cotton. And so this is actually a measure that ends up hurting the South economically more than anything else. When the fighting begins, it begins with the first battle of the Bull Run. The Union forces, we refer to them either as Union forces or Federal forces, those who are fighting for the North, attempt to march from Washington, D.C. to Richmond, Virginia, the new capital of the Confederacy after Virginia had seceded. And they meet the Confederate Army at the first battle of the Bull Run. And this was a spectacle for many people. Many wealthy people left Washington, D.C., drove out the 20, 30, 40 miles or so to watch the battle. The battle itself is a very confused affair where the Confederates are successful in the end, thanks to the leadership of a General Thomas Jackson, who becomes nicknamed Stonewall Jackson. But they are unable to follow up their victory. Even though they probably would have been able to capture Washington, D.C. at the time, the Confederates themselves are so disorganized, even in victory, that they are unable to take full advantage of their achievement. In the aftermath of the first Bull Run, the commander-in-chief, Winfield Scott, who was the hero of the Mexican-American War, he develops a new strategy called the Anaconda Strategy. He recognizes that the war is not going to be won quickly. He plans to keep an army in the east, threatening Richmond, which is only about 150 miles away from Washington, D.C., to pin the Confederates there. He plans to blockade the east coast and the coast of the Gulf of Mexico in order to limit the war supplies that the Confederacy can gain access to. And then he plans to use the rivers in the west, Mississippi River, Tennessee River, the Cumberland River, to divide and eventually conquer the Confederacy.